Welcome back to another Reading and Correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 53 of Stepping Wild. Stop fidgeting. Ern said, attaching cut fabric around Tibbs's arm with needles. I'm sure you've been poked by sharper things. Tibbs was more concerned with having to explain the lack of blood if the tailor noticed it pierced flesh. The fidgeting came about because he'd been forced to stand still too long. Knowing the fitting needed to be done didn't keep him from wanting to be out of them and on to more productive things. Can't believe they all let you do this to them. He didn't look forward to having to do this again. Ernst laughed. Theater costumes don't need to be this accurate. No one in the audience will notice if they hang loose or crooked on an actor. You, on the other hand, will be scrutinized. No noble or would-be noble lets their tailor do less than impeccable work with the material they are provided. Tibbs considered essence training as a distraction, but the one he had that didn't outright create an effect, because Tibbs had yet to crack the wall of his reserve, would lead to too many questions if this was when it happened. He settled on planning the etching he'd test and going over the ones that failed. He'd yet to figure out how he'd made mistakes, but there had to have been one. It wasn't as effective as actively testing the etching, since as soon as someone spoke to the tailor, Tibbs was reminded he was still stuck in place. Extricating himself from the crudely assembled shirt when the work was finally done was an exercise in itself, even with the tailor's help. That went onto the mannequin, then Ernst started to work on attaching the pieces that would form the pants on Tibbs. When he was finally allowed to leave the tailor's shop, Tibbs was surprised his leg didn't protest, having to work after an afternoon of standing still. The actors on the stage were engaged in a sword fight atop a mountain by the backdrop. But they kept talking, exchanging exchanges of taunt and pleading. From what he understood in the length it took him to cross from one side to the other in the dark, the male adventurer had wronged the female one. She wanted him dead for what he'd done while he was trying to explain himself. It made little sense to him. From them being on the mountain to not fighting to subdue the opponent. Explanations could come when she was disarmed, but the people filling the benches watched, captivated. Figured he'd have to endure the whole thing to work out why they did what they did. But he had to give the actors one thing. Even with them pausing to talk, their fight looked more real than anything a bard ever sung. The sound of the play dulled to indistinct murmurs well before he reached Mael's shop. She was carving a cylinder of wood nearly her height as he entered. The lines were too irregular to be a column, but what else could it be? He didn't know. She put the knife away. I was wondering when you'd come by. It's been done for a few days. I didn't want to press you. Nodded. He nodded to the door. Ernst needed me for a fitting. She unwrapped the bundle she took from a drawer and the clay crest rested on the fabric. Like the ones he'd seen in the safe, it was in the form of a heater shield with a flattened bottom. Gold wire had been used to make wheat stalks, and silver to make clouds. Blue-tinged bag of coins were etched in the clay, spilling gold and silver coins at the feet of the stalk. The crest's edge were banded in the wood he'd brought to her, polished to a pale but imperfect sheen. Imperfect shield. The Atharan family made their way into the nobility through the trading of grains, she explained. The stock and sky are supposed to represent their humble beginnings as farmers. You don't sound like it's true. The clay's color wasn't even the one on the wall was. This was streaked with pale and deep browns as well as reddish ones. He'd seen them when he collected it, but he'd expected her to mix it until it was uniform. The uniform color he thought he remembered from the ones in the safe being, but he hadn't taken the time to study them. She shrugged. Might be, but a lot of the nobles who do business with the common folk like the Atharan make up make up a history of being a history that brings them closer to those folks. All I can tell you is that if they ever worked the earth, it was well over a century ago. Can I take it now? You paid for it. Just be careful how you show it around. Even the minor nobles don't like hearing someone got their hands on their crest. He wrapped it and placed it inside his vest. Now that he had that, the paper, gold, and the right clothing, he'd be able to get into the university. He headed to his lodging, forced himself not to think about it, to go over his etching. He'd wait a few days, then he'd take the best of Ern's noble clothing and start on his research. He walked with a regalness he didn't feel. He never felt. His back was straight, his head high, and if he met another's eyes on his travel through in his travel through the street, he filled them with judgment. Nobles were always judging others. He did the same when the guard by the door demanded his credential, but, unlike those in the street, she didn't look away. He handed the crest and the papers, and as he'd watched other nobles do. Her eyes scrutinized them. Scrutinized them while her ungloved fingers ran along the edge of the crest. Tibs hadn't questioned the imperfection among the polish when he'd carefully studied the. Okay, I don't need to do to. I no longer need that because I've brought it up already. Tibs hadn't questioned the imperfections among the polish. He'd trusted the quality of Ismail's work, therefore they were there on purpose, for the guard to feel and confirm it was authentic. She handed them back the mended gold and let him in. He fought against being amazed yet again. Universities and libraries always did that to him. Their vastness, all that knowledge, the work that went into building such structure, even if magic had been used, it remained impressive. But awe was beneath a noble. They respected books were precious, knowledge held value, but they refused to show it. Tibs considered the fact such place existed at all amazing, that people were allowed to enter. That's not the right one. Allowed to enter and look through the books, gain knowledge for, in some places, as little as a handful of coppers. But even the gold he'd paid to enter didn't compare with how valuable the knowledge he could acquire while here. Large windows with colored glasses depicting no people reading and writing, discussing, chased nearly all or discussing, actually, and discussing, chased nearly all the shadows, chased away nearly all the shadows. Lamps on columns chased the little they didn't, and more would be lit as the sun set, so that people could read well into evening. Some libraries never forced people to leave once they'd entered, so long as they read and or wrote. How books were organized changed from city to city, but they all had volumes in the kingdom's language listing where specific subject could be found. Cities that saw a lot of visitors from other kingdoms, usually capitals, would also have copies of those books in varying languages. Universities were more likely to have them since they would get scholars from every kingdom looking to contribute. Once he reached the knowledge repository, the first two large set of shelves on each side of the center tables contained those books. Those were the first thing Tibs needed to consult. He'd spend a lot of time thinking. He spent a lot of time thinking about where he might find the information he needed. He couldn't look up dungeons. All that would get him were books on the existing ones. The ones the Adventurers Guild knew about and controlled, those in the mountains. He wanted those they didn't know about, those in the forest. So there could be nothing in any of the books that directly about them. What he had to go by was what he'd experienced in Iritel, how they had thought of what happened because there was a dungeon in their forest. It was dangerous. There was a monster. Which book would document places like that? Dangerous forests, places reputed to have monsters. There were books where bards' songs were recorded, but those wouldn't be reliable. Books on the histories might, but they usually focused on the people who shaped it more than the kind of places in it. That left legends and histories of so old their truth was debatable, but he'd have to start there. Searching through the tomes to learn where the books on legends were shelved took most of the day. Asking one of the scholar he saw would speed things up, but they might demand proof of who he was, and he hadn't mastered the kingdom's language yet. He doubted the local nobles spoke with an accent. By the time he'd learned which of the balconies in which of the repository the books were located, the lamps were being lit, and his stomach reminded him that, unlike what bards thought, even people with elements needed to eat. He'd be back in the morning. Now he needed to get this minor noble he pretended to be some lodging so he could change into something more comfortable and find a tavern with food and then sleep. He closed another book. The problem with legend, he realized, was they might as well have been penned by bards. Unless he found someone who had gone to one of those places, they would have. Unless he found someone who had gone to one of those places, they would have to be adventurers. What? Okay. And they would be adventurers. Okay, I know what the problem is. Unless he found someone who had gone to one of those places and they would be adventurers, he couldn't trust what he read. Dealing with adventurers was a problem in itself. Since the guild still wanted him caught for attempting to kill one of those in charge of it. He returned the book to the shelf and took another one. He couldn't stop just because the stories recorded sounded too far-fetched. One of the legends might be something close. Something someone in the city might have a better understanding of, a more accurate version of it. At least, he knew most of the languages in those books were written. In his early days of research had been spent searching for books written in Kadali-Saran and reading that, even if it had nothing to do with what he wanted to learn about. Tibs stepped into the repository he'd been hoping to delay until after he was done with this city and well on his way to another. Unfortunately, he'd promised his team a job. The clothing Ernst was making him and Cinta were more than halfway done, so he couldn't delay picking the target of his revenge. While he told this team he had followed her here, he had leeway. He hadn't said she was from this city, only that she'd been there, that from his city, only that she'd been there when she hurt him. He also hadn't said when she'd arrived in Brokentia. All he needed was someone with so many coins his team would have more than they'd ever need, who had arrived here over the last decade. Here, the city's ardent documenting of anyone entering the city worked in his favor. Even the nobles had to explain who they were and why they were entering the city. That told them who had arrived when. Working out their wealth came in the form of the city's taxation. Every building a noble owned needed to be accounted for, the size of the plot they were built on. Um, every building every building, as well as the size of the plot it was built on, a noble owned needed to be accounted for. Those with mercantile investment needed to document those as well. It gave him a sense of scale, and with that, he built a pool of potential targets. He narrowed it further by looking at how often they helped. Only those with a lot of money and a need to impress made sure every instance of their help was documented. The few who were genuine in wanting to help rarely called attention to it. Outside of a few kingdoms, nobles like that barely existed. When he narrowed the pool as much as he could by reading about nobles, all that would be left was to visit each of the houses to learn what their coffers offered. When he closed the final book, the lamplight was all he had. He had 6 names, 6 families with important women who could have hurt him, who had arrived over the last 10 years. One of them would give his team the best return for the risk involved in taking their money. He was sufficiently tired, he almost headed for his room directly. He remembered in time he was a noble, and it wouldn't do for someone like him to be in poorer neighborhoods at night. He might sleep in the noble's room this once, a short one, and it'd be good to run the roofs. The house was silent, the other residents already sleeping. The lone person awake was the cook, who also saw to the cleaning and lighting of the lamp. She didn't acknowledge him as he stepped past her and up the stairs. Servants didn't question what nobles got up to, or why they returned at such late hour. The key turned loudly in the silence, but the door opened without a sound. The key turned just as loudly, locking the door, and the sound was followed by the striking of a fire starter. Tibs spun as spark caught on the lamp's wick. "I think you owe us an explanation," the man seated next to it said as he placed the crystal chimney in play, as he returned, as he set the crystal chimney in place. And that concludes chapter 53 of Stepping Wild. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story, it is up for free on Royal Road. If you want to read ahead of that and support me in the process, that is on Ream Story, where you can read about a dozen chapters ahead. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. Links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.